The suffocating heat of the adobe room pressed down, a cruel, invisible hand squeezing the last breath from the air, from her lungs, from her very soul. She stood, a slender silhouette against the brutal sunlight bleeding through a single, grimy window, her eyes wide and dark as an ancient well fixed on the scuffed wooden floor. Maria, that was her name, a name that now felt like a whispered prayer, a fading echo in a world determined to erase it. She was 16, barely, and today her childhood was not just ending. It was being meticulously, publicly dismantled. The air thrummed with a grotesque anticipation, a predatory hush that promised not a blessing, but a blight. This wasn't a market for livestock, though the pungent scent of dust and desperation clung to the air like a shroud. This was a market for lives, for futures, for the fragile innocence of a girl who had known little beyond sun-baked earth, and the whisper of poverty's relentless breath. Each shadow that stretched across the floor seemed to lengthen, becoming a hungry maw, ready to swallow her whole. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird desperate for flight, yet knowing only the impending fall. The faces in the room, blurred shapes in the periphery of her terror, were a tapestry of grim expectation. Some bore the vacant stare of boredom, others the glint of avarice. They were the arbiters of her fate, men who saw not a girl, but a commodity, a ledger entry, a silent transaction. The very air vibrated with the unspoken word, virgin, a chilling pronouncement that sealed her destiny, binding her to an invisible, yet unbreakable chain. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to rip the coarse fabric of her threadbare dress and vanish into the very dust from which she came, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the rising tide of fear. A silent scream echoed only within the confines of her own skull, a desperate, futile plea against the inevitable. It was here, in this sun-drenched purgatory, that her life was to be sold, a brutal truth that cut deeper than any blade. Her future, once a whispered hope, now lay before her, a desolate, barren landscape stretching into an unknown abyss. This was the moment, the terrifying precipice, where innocence met its cruelest end. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The shuffling of boots on the dirt floor, the low murmur of voices, the occasional sharp clearing of a throat. Each sound was a hammer blow against Maria's fragile composure. Her gaze remained fixed downward, refusing to meet the eyes that surely stripped her of dignity, dissecting her very being with their cold, assessing glares. The man officiating, a portly figure with slicked-back hair and a cruel glint in his eye, cleared his throat, the sound booming in the constrained space. Attention, gentlemen. We have before us tonight Maria Elena Rodriguez, 16 years of age, unblemished as is clearly evident, strong, healthy, and skilled in domestic duties. A fine specimen indeed for any man seeking a compliant addition to his household. His words hung in the air, a venomous cloud, each syllable a calculated insult, reducing her to less than human. Maria's nails dug into her palms, crescent moons of pain blooming beneath her skin, a physical anchor in the whirlwind of her shame. Unblemished. The word echoed, a grotesque irony, for inside, she felt utterly defiled. Every nerve ending screamed, a silent protest against the commodification of her flesh, the brutal dissection of her personhood. She was not a field of crops, nor a beast of burden, yet she was being described with the same cold, calculating efficiency. The collective gaze of the men felt like a palpable weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She could feel the heat radiating from their hungry stares, an insidious warmth that promised only violation. A dry cough, then a voice, gruff and impatient, sliced through the quiet. "Let's get on with it, Mateo. What's the starting bid?" The auctioneer, Mateo, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the greed he embodied, smiled, a flash of yellow teeth. "Ah, yes, gentlemen, always eager. We shall begin this particular treasure at 500 pesos. A ripple went through the small crowd. 500. It was a fortune, and yet for the prize they sought, it was merely a pittance. Maria's breath hitched. 500 pesos. Her family had barely seen that in a year, scratching out a meager existence from the unforgiving earth. She thought of her mother's tired eyes, her father's stooped shoulders, the hungry faces of her younger siblings. This grotesque ritual, this degradation, was their last desperate hope for survival. The weight of their hunger, their dwindling prospects, settled upon her, heavier than any physical chain. The bids began then, a slow, methodical ascent. Each number whispered or grunted, signifying a deeper plunge into the abyss for Maria. 700, 800, 1,000. Each increment felt like a chip taken from her very soul, a piece of her essence sold to the highest bidder. The air grew thicker, charged with a perverse excitement, as the sum climbed higher, spiraling upward, pulling her inexorably towards an unimaginable future. She dared not look, but she could feel the presence of each man, a distinct unsettling aura, a predator sizing up its prey. The world tilted on its axis, her fate hanging by the thinnest of threads, tethered to the whims of strangers. The bidding continued, a relentless drumbeat against the silence of Maria's terror. 1,100, 12. Each number, a fresh wave of nausea, a deeper plunge into the crushing reality of her predicament. Her mind, in a desperate attempt to escape, conjured images of the small, sun-baked garden behind her family's shack, the scent of damp earth after a rare rain, the scratchy warmth of her mother's rebozo, faint echoes of laughter, long since extinguished by the relentless march of hunger and despair. These fleeting images were the only solace, a momentary reprieve from the suffocating present. The men's voices, once distinct, began to merge into an indistinguishable drone, a hateful chorus that spoke of ownership and power. Maria knew little of the world beyond her village, her life a circumscribed existence dictated by the cycles of the sun and the harsh demands of subsistence farming. She had heard whispers of such auctions, dark tales passed in hushed tones, but they had always seemed distant, a horror that happened to others. Never had she imagined herself standing in the crucible of such a depraved spectacle, reduced to a mere chattel. The auctioneer, Mateo, his face flushed with the thrill of the rising bids, was about to call out, 1,300, going once, going twice, when a new voice, low and resonant, cut through the tension. It was not a shout nor an eager grunt, but a measured, almost deliberate tone that nonetheless commanded immediate attention. 2,000. The room went utterly still. The collective gasp was almost audible. 2,000 pesos. It was an astronomical sum, far exceeding any previous bid, silencing the smaller, more tentative offers. Maria, despite herself, lifted her head slightly, her gaze drawn by an invisible thread. She saw him then, a man standing in the shadows at the back of the room, almost obscured by the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and toil, his skin tanned to a deep bronze. His eyes, though, were what struck her. Pale, almost startlingly light against his dark skin, they held a quiet intensity, a stillness that was both unsettling and profoundly arresting. He was a white man, yes, but not of the kind who frequented these parts, not with the polished arrogance or the hungry eyes of the other bidders. He wore simple, functional clothes, the fabric worn but clean, smelling faintly of earth and something indefinable, something ancient. He was a farmer, she instinctively knew from the deep lines etched around his eyes, the calloused hands, the way he carried himself with an unassuming solidity. Yet his presence here felt like a rupture in the expected order of things. Who was this man? Why did he offer such a sum? Was he a savior or merely a different kind of predator, cloaked in a more enigmatic silence? The mystery of him hung heavy in the air, a new, unsettling current in the room's already charged atmosphere. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum, now beat with a different rhythm, one of raw, unadulterated confusion. Mateo, the auctioneer, recovered first, his initial shock giving way to a triumphant grin. 2,000 pesos was an unheard-of sum for a girl, even one described as unblemished. He smacked his gavel down with unnecessary force. 2,000, sold, to the gentleman in the back. The words echoed, final and absolute, sealing Maria's fate. Her knees threatened to buckle. Sold. The word vibrated in her bones, a sentence passed without trial, without appeal. The men in the room grumbled, some exchanging resentful glances towards the silent farmer. others simply shaking their heads, clearly outmaneuvered. Maria watched, her breath shallow as the farmer detached himself from the shadows. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his gaze never leaving her. It wasn't a predatory stare, but one that seemed to probe, to assess, yet without the usual leering hunger. It was unnerving in its intensity, a gaze that suggested deep thought, perhaps even sorrow, but certainly not the lechery she had braced herself for. He approached her, his presence dominating the small space, and she flinched, instinctively recoiling. She felt like a small trapped animal cornered and awaiting its fate. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes, those pale, disconcerting eyes, still fixed on her. Then, to her astonishment, he extended a hand. Not to grab her, not to assert ownership, but an open, almost inviting gesture, as if offering assistance. She stared at it, bewildered. It was a hand roughened by labor, deeply tanned, the nails clipped short and clean. It seemed to embody the harshness of the land, yet paradoxically, it offered a strange, unreadable promise. "Come," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, a low rumble that vibrated through the dust-filled air. It was the first word he had spoken directly to her, and it carried no command, only an invitation. Still, she hesitated, fear warring with a strange, nascent curiosity. What awaited her? Another form of slavery? A life of unseen torment? Or perhaps, just perhaps, something utterly unforeseen, something beyond the grim expectations of her world. She had known only one path, the familiar, brutal path of poverty. Now she was being pulled onto another, one shrouded in mystery, guided by a man who seemed to defy easy categorization. She looked at Mateo, who was already counting the thick wad of bills the farmer had produced. The transaction was complete. There was no turning back. With a trembling hand, she reached out, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, warm. He didn't pull her, didn't force her, but simply waited, allowing her to make the almost imperceptible movement towards him. It was a gesture of respect, however small, that shocked her more than any overt act of aggression could have. He then turned, and without another word, began to lead her out of the room, away from the stench of human commerce, into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. Her new reality was beginning, one step at a time, each step weighted with uncertainty. The journey to his farm was long, silent, and punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels on the rutted dirt road. Maria sat huddled on the wooden bench, her small frame dwarfed by the vast, empty landscape that stretched endlessly beneath the searing sun. The farmer, whose name she still did not know, sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his silhouette stark against the sky. He had offered her water from a worn canteen, a simple gesture, yet one that had surprised her with its quiet consideration. She had drunk deeply, her throat parched not just from thirst, but from the fear that still clung to her like a second skin. The silence between them was not entirely oppressive. It was a heavy quiet, laden with unspoken questions, with the vast chasm of their disparate lives. She risked stolen glances at him, trying to decipher the enigma he presented. His hands gripping the reins were large and capable, the knuckles scarred, the nails ingrained with soil. He seemed a part of this land, as ancient and unyielding as the gnarled mesquite trees that dotted the landscape. He smelled of sweat and dry earth and something else, something clean and honest, unlike the cloying scents of the men who had bid on her. She wondered about his home, his life, the purpose behind his extraordinary purchase. Was this just a new form of servitude? Would she be put to work in the fields under the relentless sun? Would her body, deemed unblemished, become his property in every sense imaginable? The questions swirled in her mind, a dizzying current of anxiety, yet she dared not voice them. Her voice, she knew, was not her own now. Her home, her family's meager dwelling, felt impossibly distant, a fading dream. She thought of her younger sister, little Sophia, with her bright, inquisitive eyes, and her brother Miguel, whose cough had grown steadily worse in the damp, cold nights. Their hunger had been a gnawing pain, a constant shadow over their lives. The very reason she was here, being carted away like a sack of grain, a bitter taste filled her mouth. What would become of them? Had her sacrifice truly bought them enough time, enough food to survive? The irony of her situation was a cruel torment. She had been sold for their survival, yet she was now utterly alone, severed from the very people she had hoped to save. The wagon finally slowed, turning onto a narrow track that led to a small, isolated farm. A humble adobe house, weathered and unassuming, stood amidst a few scraggly trees. A small patch of irrigated land, surprisingly green, lay behind it. There was a quiet, almost desolate beauty to the place, a stark contrast to the oppressive clamor of the auction house. This was his world, now hers. He stopped the wagon, dismounted, and without a word, extended his hand again to help her down. His gaze met hers for a fleeting moment, and in those pale eyes, she saw not kindness, but a deep, unfathomable weariness. It was then she realized that perhaps he too carried a burden, a heavy, unseen weight that shaped his silence. Her fear was still a tangible presence, but it was now laced with a tremor of something new. Confusion. Days bled into weeks, each one a slow, measured rhythm dictated by the demands of the land. Maria's initial fear of the silent farmer, whose name she finally learned was Elias, slowly began to morph, not into trust, but into a bewildered acceptance, a grudging recognition of a life she could not have foreseen. He did not ask her to work the fields, nor did he demand anything beyond her presence. He provided food, simple but nourishing, and a small, clean room in his modest adobe house. It was sparsely furnished, just a cot, a wooden chest, and a window that looked out onto the vast, indifferent desert, but it was her own. She ate in silence opposite him at a rough-hewn table, the clinking of spoons against ceramic the loudest sound in the small dwelling. Elias rarely spoke, his conversation limited to terse instructions about small household chores, fetching water from the well, sweeping the dirt floor, tending to the few chickens he kept. His eyes, however, seemed to constantly observe her, a silent, watchful presence that was both unnerving and, at times, strangely comforting. He never raised his voice, never laid a hand on her, never made a demand that implied ownership beyond the material. This stark absence of the cruelty she had braced herself for was a bewildering anomaly. One evening, after a particularly arduous day of hauling water, Maria sat outside, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it struck her with a pang, a reminder of the world's indifference to her plight. Elias emerged from the house carrying 2 battered tin mugs. He set one down beside her, the steam rising from its surface carrying the faint scent of chamomile. He sat a respectful distance away, his gaze also fixed on the dying light. "It helps with the ache," he murmured, his voice a low gravel. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her outside of a direct instruction. Maria looked at the steaming mug, then at him. He wasn't looking at her, but at the sprawling expanse of his fields, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor passing through his broad shoulders. He seemed burdened, not by the land's demands, but by something internal, something he carried in the quiet depths of his being. She took a tentative sip of the tea. It was warm, soothing, and for the first time since her arrival, a sliver of tension began to ease its grip on her. This unexpected act of consideration, the simple offering of comfort, chipped away at the hardened shell of her fear. It was not a grand gesture, no dramatic pronouncement, but a quiet, human one. She didn't understand him, not truly. He remained an enigma, a man of profound silences and unexpected mercies, but in that moment, under the vast, darkening sky, a different kind of curiosity began to bloom within her, replacing the initial fear. She wondered if his silence was not a fortress built against her, but perhaps a prison of his own making, a quiet sorrow too deep for words. The chamomile tea had become a small ritual, a quiet truce between them. Maria started to observe Elias more closely, seeing beyond the initial shock and suspicion. She noticed the way his gaze lingered on a withered rosebush near the house, a faint sadness in his eyes. She saw the care he put into tending his fields, his hands moving with a practiced tenderness that belied their strength. He was a man deeply connected to the earth, a protector of the fragile life it offered. One afternoon, while sorting dried herbs, Maria stumbled upon a small, faded photograph tucked inside a worn Bible. It was a picture of a woman, her face gentle, her eyes strikingly similar to Elias's pale, watchful gaze. She was holding a small child, a girl with dark braided hair, perhaps Maria's age. A sense of unease, then a prickle of recognition, washed over her. The woman's dress, the style of the photograph, spoke of a time long past. As if sensing her discovery, Elias entered the room, his movements as quiet as ever. His eyes fell on the photograph in her hand, and for the first time, Maria saw a profound grief flash across his usually impassive face. He did not snatch it away, nor did he scold her. Instead, he slowly reached for it, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. He sat down heavily on a wooden stool, the weight of a silent sorrow settling over him. "My daughter," he said, his voice raw, barely a whisper. "And my wife, Clara." He paused, a long, aching silence stretching between them. "They were taken from me, years ago. The fever." He didn't elaborate, but the unspoken pain in his voice was a vast, desolate landscape. Then his gaze, heavy with memory, lifted to meet hers. The men who came for Clara, they were not unlike those at the auction. Different words, same hunger. They saw opportunity and weakness. She was ill, vulnerable. They took her. And then, the fever took her too. And my daughter Isabella, she followed not long after, her spirit broken. Maria felt a chill creep up her spine, not of fear, but of profound understanding. He wasn't talking about illness alone. He was talking about the same brutal system, the same predatory exploitation that had put her on the auction block. The fever was a euphemism, a veil for the darkness that had consumed his family. He had bought her not for profit, not for lust, but because he saw in her something of what he had lost. He saw a mirror of his own tragedy, a chance to perhaps, in some small, desperate way, atone for the helplessness he had felt then. His eyes, those pale, startling eyes, suddenly seemed less enigmatic and more like deep pools of sorrow, reflecting a pain too vast to articulate. He had saved her, not because he was a righteous man, but because he was a wounded one. He had raised his hand not out of salvation, but out of a desperate, perhaps futile attempt to rewrite a fragment of his own tragic past, to prevent another innocent from suffering the same cruel fate. The silent farmer was not silent out of choice, but out of the weight of an unbearable memory. The air in the small room seemed to thicken with the unspoken truth, heavy with the ghosts of Elias's past. Maria stared at him, the photograph of his lost family a stark image between them. The initial confusion about his motives, the gnawing suspicion that had shadowed her every day on the farm, began to dissipate, replaced by a complex tapestry of emotions, shock, pity, and a profound, unsettling empathy. This man, who had seemed a silent, unreadable force, was not so different from her. He too had been a victim of a cruel world, though his chains were forged from grief rather than poverty. They took them? Maria finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The question hung in the air, a delicate tendril seeking connection. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the faded image, his face etched with a pain that years had not dulled. "They took everything," he reiterated, his voice barely audible, a mournful whisper carried on the dust-filled air. "My land was cursed. They took the crop, then the livestock, then the hope, and when the fever came, they took advantage of that weakness too, offering false cures, forcing desperate deals. Clara was not well. She tried to fight, but they had the power." Maria suddenly understood the true meaning of the fever in his eyes. It was not just illness, but the systemic decay, the exploitation, the ruthless avarice that preyed on the vulnerable. She saw the bitter irony in his act of purchasing her. He had used the very mechanism that had destroyed his life to save hers. It was a desperate, almost defiant act against the forces that had taken his family. A wave of shame washed over Maria. She had judged him, feared him, seen him as another extension of the very system that had placed her on the auction block. Yet he had done what no one else would. He had intervened. He had paid a king's ransom to spare her the unknown horrors that awaited. His silence, which she had perceived as aloofness or even contempt, was now revealed as the silence of profound sorrow, of a man whose words had been stripped from him by an unspeakable loss. "Why me?" she asked, her voice cracking, the raw honesty of the question echoing in the quiet room. Elias looked up, his pale eyes meeting her dark ones. You reminded me of Isabella, her spirit, the way she looked at the world, even when it was cruel. He paused, a deep sigh escaping him. I could not save them, but you were there, and I had the means, a chance to undo something perhaps, to offer a different path. His words were not an apology, nor a demand for gratitude, but a simple, stark confession. It was not a confession of love or even immediate compassion, but a profound, weary act of human connection. In that shared vulnerability, the invisible walls between them began to crumble. Her anger, her resentment, her deep-seated fear began to recede, replaced by a fragile sense of understanding, a shared burden of sorrow, and the possibility of a different kind of future. The path ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with the injustices of their world, but she no longer walked it alone. The years that followed layered themselves upon Maria like the dust on the desert floor, each one adding to her resilience, deepening her roots in this unforgiving land. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been auctioned off. She was a woman, shaped by hardship and by the quiet, enduring presence of Elias. Their relationship had evolved beyond the confines of owner and purchased, or even rescuer and rescued. It was a partnership born of necessity, tempered by mutual respect, and deepened by the unspoken understanding of their intertwined destinies. They farmed the land together, battling the relentless sun and the scarcity of water, their silent efforts a testament to survival. Elias, still a man of few words, communicated more through his actions. The quiet way he made sure her tools were sharp, the small portion of meat he saved for her, the almost imperceptible nod of approval when she mastered a new task. Maria, in turn, learned to read his subtle cues, understanding the nuances of his moods, the unspoken weight of his memories that still shadowed his pale eyes. The pain of her past, the image of her family, never truly faded. It was a constant ache, a phantom limb, but it no longer consumed her. She knew with a certainty that had grown over the years that the money Elias had paid had given her family a chance, a brief reprieve from the hunger that had driven her to the auction. She held on to that truth, a fragile comfort. She had often wondered about leaving, about venturing back to her village, but the ties to this desolate yet life-giving farm had grown too strong. It was her home now, and Elias, in his quiet, profound way, was her family. He had not offered love in the conventional sense, nor had he sought it. He had offered sanctuary, purpose, and a shared existence in a world that had stripped them both bare. The irony of her fate was stark. Sold into what should have been bondage, she had found a strange form of freedom. The market that had sought to destroy her had, through a twist of fate and the desperate act of a grieving man, delivered her to a life of quiet dignity. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in a final, fiery flourish of orange and rose, Maria often found herself standing beside Elias, watching the vast expanse of their land. The silence that enveloped them was no longer tense. It was profound, filled with the echoes of their shared past and the quiet hope of their uncertain future. The land stretched before them, harsh and beautiful, a mirror of their lives. It was not a grand cinematic ending, no triumphant escape or sudden blossoming of romance. It was a grounded reality, a testament to endurance. The shadows of past sorrows would always linger, a dark thread woven into the fabric of their days. But within those shadows, a resilient flame of hope flickered, nurtured by the silent pact between a Mexican girl who was bought and the white farmer who bought her, not for possession, but for a chance at quiet redemption. Their lives, intertwined by a single desperate act, continued, a testament to the enduring human spirit, finding light in the darkest corners of a cruel world. The story of Maria was not one of fairy tale salvation, but of a quiet, hard-won peace found amidst the dust and the ghosts, a testament to the unforeseen paths forged in the crucible of human suffering.